On December 26, 2025, Benjamin Netanyahu picked up the phone and made a call that he believed would reshape the strategic map of East Africa and the Red Sea forever. On the other end of the line was the president of Somaliland, a breakaway territory in the Horn of Africa that has been seeking international recognition since 1991, over 3 decades of diplomatic isolation with nothing to show for it. By the end of that call, Israel had become the first country in the world to formally recognize Somaliland as an independent state. Netanyahu called it a seminal and historic moment. He pledged to open embassies. He promised to advocate for Somaliland's inclusion in the Abraham Accords directly to Donald Trump. And he positioned Israel as the pioneer of a new geopolitical reality in one of the world's most strategically critical maritime corridors. Within hours, the reaction from Mogadishu, Cairo, Ankara, and Riyadh was explosive. Within days, Somalia had canceled every defense and security agreement it held with the United Arab Emirates. Within weeks, Saudi Arabia had signed a military cooperation memorandum with Somalia, began assembling a regional coalition that spans Turkey, Egypt, Eritrea, Djibouti, Pakistan, and Qatar, and had effectively forced the UAE out of both Yemen and Somalia in the same month. What Netanyahu thought was a masterstroke turned out to trigger a countermove so swift, so comprehensive, and so geopolitically consequential that analysts at the Gulf International Forum are now describing it as Saudi Arabia's most calculated strategic play in the Horn of Africa in living memory. This is the story of how Mohammed bin Salman turned a single Israeli diplomatic announcement into the opportunity to block the UAE-Israel expansion in Africa, assert Saudi dominance over the Red Sea corridor, and rewrite the rules of Gulf engagement in East Africa. Every detail in this script is documented, verified, and drawn from the most credible geopolitical institutions on Earth. This is not opinion. This is what actually happened, and why it matters more than almost anyone in the Western world is currently paying attention to. To understand why the Israeli recognition of Somaliland hit Saudi Arabia and the broader region like a strategic earthquake, you first need to understand what Somaliland actually is, and why its geography makes it one of the most coveted pieces of real estate on the planet. Somaliland declared independence from Somalia in 1991 following the collapse of the Siad Barre regime in a brutal civil war. For over 3 decades, it functioned as a de facto state, holding its own elections, issuing its own currency, running its own courts, maintaining its own national army and coast guard, while the rest of Somalia descended into warlordism, humanitarian catastrophe, and the kind of failed state anarchy that required an international intervention that peaked with the Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu in 1993. Somaliland, by contrast, kept its territory relatively secure. It built institutions. It held multiple peaceful transfers of power. By any functional measure, it behaved like a state. But the international community, bound by the African Union's commitment to colonial-era borders and the principle of territorial integrity, refused to grant it formal recognition. For 34 years, Somaliland existed in a kind of sovereign limbo, real enough to govern itself, invisible enough to be exploited by everyone around it. And exploited it was. Because what Somaliland possesses, in geographic terms, is extraordinary. Its coastline sits directly on the Gulf of Aden, overlooking the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth. Approximately 12% of global trade flows through this strait, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean and linking the Mediterranean to Asia. Every container ship, every oil tanker, every cargo vessel moving between Europe and Asia passes through this narrow corridor. Whoever controls the ports and military positions along this coastline has a hand on the jugular of global commerce. Berbera, Somaliland's main deepwater port, sits precisely on that choke point. It has a long runway airfield suitable for military operations. It has a strategic position that makes it ideal for maritime surveillance, counterterrorism operations, logistics hubs, and intelligence gathering. The United Arab Emirates recognized this strategic value years before Israel did. DP World, the UAE's state-linked port operator, one of the largest in the world, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in expanding Berbera's port infrastructure. The UAE used Berbera as a key hub for its regional logistics and military projection networks. It built the port up, built the road connecting it to Ethiopia, and built itself a forward position on the Gulf of Aden that served its interests in East African commerce, its competition with Saudi Arabia for Red Sea dominance, and its broader vision of itself as the Arab world's maritime and logistics superpower. And then Israel arrived. The Washington Institute has documented that initial Israeli-Somaliland discussions began quietly 4 years before the recognition announcement, well before the Houthi crisis elevated the Red Sea to the top of every security agenda in the world. But it was the acceleration of those negotiations through 2025, driven by the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping that had been terrorizing global commerce since late 2023, that pushed Netanyahu toward formal recognition. Israel's strategic logic was not subtle. It needed a partner on the Red Sea coast to monitor Houthi activity, to provide potential operational staging for counter-Houthi operations, and to give Israeli forces and intelligence services a forward position in a region that the Houthi threat had made existentially relevant to Israeli security. Somaliland's president had publicly offered the United States military basing rights at Berbera and exclusive access to critical minerals, including lithium and coltan, in exchange for formal recognition. He had said in a July 2025 interview that the path to recognition lies in cooperating with the world on security, trade, counterterrorism, piracy, and smuggling. Israel and Somaliland signed the recognition deal on December 26th. Netanyahu pledged full diplomatic relations, the exchange of ambassadors and embassies, and cooperation in agriculture, economic development, and security. The Israeli Institute for National Security Studies had actually warned, in a paper published just weeks before the recognition, that Israel had compelling reasons to refrain from becoming the first state to formally recognize Somaliland, specifically because of the regional backlash that would follow. The paper recommended developing ties to a level just below formal recognition, building strong security and economic associations without the diplomatic declaration that would trigger Arab condemnation. Netanyahu did not follow that advice. He went for full recognition. And the backlash was immediate, total, and orchestrated by Riyadh, with a precision that suggested Saudi Arabia had been preparing for exactly this moment. Saudi Arabia responded at once. Riyadh leveraged its influence to mobilize a region-wide censure of the Israeli move. The Arab League condemned it. The African Union condemned it. The Gulf Cooperation Council condemned it. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, mobilized directly by Riyadh, issued a communique describing Israel's recognition of Somaliland as a direct threat to the peace and security of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region. The foreign ministers of Somalia, Egypt, Turkey, and Djibouti issued a joint statement of total rejection, stressing their full support for the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Somalia. Saudi Arabia did not simply react diplomatically, it moved. Within days of Israel's announcement, Saudi Arabia was advancing talks with Mogadishu to form a direct military partnership. On February 9, 2026, a matter of weeks after the Israeli recognition, Saudi Arabia and Somalia signed a memorandum of understanding on military cooperation. The Gulf International Forum described this as a calculated effort to reshape the Red Sea security order by ending Emirati influence, countering Iranian-aligned threats, and safeguarding the maritime and economic foundations of Vision 2030. Somalia, the forum noted, is no longer a peripheral concern for Riyadh. It has become a key arena where Gulf rivalry, maritime insecurity, and Saudi ambitions converge. But to understand just how brilliantly calculated Saudi Arabia's Somalia play actually is, you need to understand what the UAE stood to lose, and how the Israeli recognition of Somaliland exposed a fault line between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that Saudi Arabia immediately exploited to devastating effect. The UAE had built its Somaliland position over years. DP World's investment in Berbera was not charity. It was a strategic asset, a deepwater port on the Gulf of Aden that gave Abu Dhabi forward positioning in the Red Sea, a logistics hub that connected to Ethiopia, and a foothold in East Africa that served the UAE's long-term vision of itself as the dominant maritime and commercial power of the wider Arab-African corridor. The UAE had done the same thing across the East African coastline, acquiring port concessions in Eritrea, Djibouti, and Mozambique as part of a network of maritime footholds that give Abu Dhabi reach far beyond the Gulf. This network is the physical expression of the UAE's strategic worldview, that the future of Gulf power lies not just in oil wealth, but in controlling the ports, logistics routes, and commercial arteries that connect the world. Now, here is the critical detail that most observers missed, and that made Israel's recognition of Somaliland so geopolitically explosive for the Saudi-UAE relationship. The UAE had not officially recognized Somaliland's independence. It had invested in Berbera, built the port, cultivated deep relationships with Somaliland's leadership, but it had maintained formal ambiguity about sovereignty, refusing to explicitly back Somaliland's independence claim in order to avoid the diplomatic costs of defying the African Union and the broader international consensus on territorial integrity. When Israel formally recognized Somaliland, the Arab Center DC reported that the UAE refused to sign the joint Arab League OIC statement condemning Israel's recognition. Every other Arab state signed. The UAE did not. The Arab Center DC noted that the UAE's position may have contributed to Israel's decision to go ahead with recognition, essentially suggesting that Abu Dhabi had given at minimum tacit encouragement to Tel Aviv's move. That refusal to condemn Israel's recognition of Somaliland, in the context of a moment when Saudi Arabia was mobilizing the entire Arab and Islamic world to condemn it, was read in Riyadh as confirmation of something Mbs'S had long suspected, that the UAE and Israel were operating as a coordinated strategic axis in the Horn of Africa, pursuing shared goals that directly threatened Saudi interests. The Somali government reached the same conclusion, and acted on it with consequences that immediately devastated years of Emirati investment. On January 12, 2026, Somalia's cabinet announced the cancellation of all defense, security, and port operations agreements with the UAE. Somalia's defense minister, Ahmed Mualim Fiki, stated publicly that the decision was based on evidence that the UAE was undermining the sovereignty, national unity, and political independence of the Republic of Somalia. Somalia also imposed a prohibition on military and cargo aircraft owned or leased by the UAE from using Somali airspace. The trigger for the final break was a specific incident. The UAE had allegedly allowed Idris al-Zubaydi, the leader of Yemen's Southern Transitional Council, a separatist figure who was at that very moment presiding over the UAE-backed STC's military offensive in southern Yemen, to transit through Somali territory without Mogadishu's knowledge or approval. Zubaydi reportedly fled Aden to Somaliland and then boarded a UAE-linked flight to Mogadishu and on to Abu Dhabi. To the Somali government, the unauthorized transit of the leader of a UAE-backed secessionist movement through their airspace was not a coincidence. It was evidence that the UAE was treating their territory as its own private logistics corridor, and doing so in the service of a separatist network that the UAE was simultaneously running in Yemen and enabling in Somaliland. The UAE began evacuating personnel from Berbera port. Reports from the Horn Review indicated that the UAE started disassembling radar equipment and other hardware in Bosaso port, another key Emirati asset on the Gulf of Aden that had served as a hub for UAE supply operations in the region. The UAE also airlifted personnel and equipment from Mogadishu to Addis Ababa. In a matter of weeks, an Emirati network in the Horn of Africa that had been built over more than a decade, with hundreds of millions of dollars of port investment, military training facilities, security cooperation agreements, and political relationships, had been dismantled and expelled, and Saudi Arabia had replaced it. The speed and comprehensiveness of the Emirati collapse in the Horn of Africa, coinciding with the UAE's simultaneous military withdrawal from Yemen following Saudi airstrikes on Mukalla port, represented a strategic rout of extraordinary magnitude. Two of the UAE's most important theaters of regional influence, Yemen and Somalia, were lost within the same month, and Saudi Arabia was the force that had driven both outcomes. Now, step back for a moment and look at the full strategic picture that Saudi Arabia has assembled, because it is genuinely remarkable in its scope and sophistication. The Horn Review has described what has emerged as a coalition of the status quo, a multilateral front led by Saudi Arabia in strategic coordination with Turkey, Egypt, Eritrea, Sudan's recognized government, Djibouti, Pakistan, and Qatar, operationalized through a series of maritime pacts, military cooperation agreements, and diplomatic coordination mechanisms, all specifically designed to dismantle the expanding influence of what the analysis describes as the UAE-Ethiopia-Israel triangle. Let us unpack what that means in practice. Saudi Arabia has signed a military cooperation memorandum with Somalia. It has mobilized the OIC to condemn Israel's Somaliland recognition in the strongest possible terms. It has strengthened Egypt's position against the UAE's support for Sudan's rapid support forces. Egypt, which deeply distrusts Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam dispute and the water security of the Nile, has aligned with Saudi Arabia's position in Somalia precisely because Ethiopian access to a Red Sea port via Somaliland or Berbera would give Addis Ababa maritime reach that fundamentally threatens Egyptian strategic interests. Turkey, which has its own military training presence in Somalia, its own naval agreements with Mogadishu, and its own ideological alignment with movements that oppose the UAE's anti-Islamist agenda, has coordinated closely with Riyadh in condemning Israel's recognition and reinforcing Somali sovereignty. The Horn Review has described how Saudi mediation bridged the historical rift between Turkey and Egypt, two countries that have clashed bitterly over Mediterranean exclusive economic zones and over ideological differences tied to Turkish support for the Muslim Brotherhood, enabling indirect Turkish-Egyptian coordination in the Horn of Africa without requiring a formal bilateral alliance between them. That is a diplomatic feat of considerable sophistication. Riyadh brought together countries that normally cannot agree on anything and pointed them in the same direction, against the UAE-Israel-Ethiopia axis operating in the Horn. And Mbs'S used his personal relationship with Donald Trump, cultivated through the $300 billion in agreements signed during Trump's May 2025 Gulf visit, and the landmark designation of Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally during Mbs'S November 2025 Washington visit to push American policy toward the Saudi position as well. GIS Reports has documented that during Mbs'S November 2025 visit to Washington, he specifically pushed Sudan and Somalia onto Trump's agenda. The Trump administration has since been expected to devote greater diplomatic effort to ending the Sudanese civil war on terms that align with Saudi preferences, not Emirati ones. Saudi Arabia has successfully used its transactional relationship with the Trump White House to shape American policy in a direction that serves Riyadh's regional interests and directly undermines Abu Dhabi's. The strategic logic behind Saudi Arabia's Somalia play is inseparable from Vision 2030, and this is where the full picture becomes truly coherent. Saudi Arabia's grand economic transformation plan is not just about building entertainment cities and attracting technology companies to Riyadh. At its geographic foundation, Vision 2030 requires Saudi Arabia to secure and control the maritime corridors through which its oil exports, and eventually its diversified non-oil exports, will reach global markets. The Red Sea is not a backdrop to Vision 2030. It is one of its most critical arteries. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 6 to 7 million barrels of oil per day, much of it passing through or near the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping that began in late 2023, and that by 2025 had forced massive rerouting of global shipping lanes at enormous cost to Saudi export economics, demonstrated with brutal clarity exactly how vulnerable those arteries are. The Gulf International Forum has noted that Houthi operations in the Red Sea had intensified through 2025, forcing reroutes that increased the cost of Saudi exports and threatened the financial foundations of Vision 2030's diversification programs. If Saudi Arabia cannot guarantee that the maritime approaches to the Red Sea are secured and that no hostile power controls the choke points through which its trade must pass, then every megaproject, every diversification initiative, every foreign investment ambition built into Vision 2030 rests on an unstable foundation. This is why Somalia matters so profoundly to Mbs'S. Somalia's federal government controls the coastline of the Gulf of Aden on the southern side of the Bab al-Mandeb approach. A Saudi-aligned, Saudi-supported Somalia, with its defense agreements intact, its territorial integrity defended, and its central government strengthened against both UAE-backed fragmentation and al-Shabaab insurgency, is an essential piece of the maritime security architecture that Saudi Arabia needs for Vision 2030 to work. A fragmented Somalia, with Somaliland operating as an independent state, hosting Israeli intelligence facilities, UAE port operations, and potentially American military bases, outside Mogadishu's authority and outside Saudi Arabia's influence, is a direct strategic threat to everything Riyadh is building. This is not sentiment. This is geography. And Mbs'S understands geography with the precision of someone who has staked his entire historical legacy on getting it right. The Horn Review, in its analysis of Saudi Arabia's prospective naval ambitions in Somalia, has reported that Riyadh has been exploring the possibility of securing a naval base at Las Korai, a port in the Sanag region of northern Somalia. A Saudi naval presence at Las Korai would give Riyadh the ability to monitor Houthi activities in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden directly, support rapid response operations to interrupt Iranian arms smuggling to the Houthis through the Horn of Africa, and establish a permanent Saudi military footprint in the maritime approaches to the Bab al-Mandeb. That would be a transformative development, giving Saudi Arabia direct naval reach into the choke point that it needs to secure for the entire economic future of Vision 2030. It would also place Saudi military assets precisely in the maritime space that the UAE had hoped to dominate through its Berbera investments and that Israel had hoped to access through its Somaliland recognition deal. The UAE-Israel-Ethiopia triangle that Saudi Arabia is now systematically dismantling represents something more than just three countries with overlapping interests. It represents a specific vision of what the Horn of Africa's geopolitical future should look like, one built on fragmented transactional relationships with sub-state actors like Somaliland and the Southern Transitional Council, rather than on the formal sovereignty of recognized central governments. The UAE has consistently pursued this model across multiple theaters. In Yemen, it backed the STC, a secessionist force that sought to split the country, giving the UAE control over southern ports without the complications of dealing with a unified Yemeni government that answered to Riyadh. In Sudan, it backed the RSF, a paramilitary force that challenged the authority of the central government, giving the UAE leverage over political outcomes without having to work through legitimate state institutions. In Somalia, it invested in Berbera, building infrastructure in a territory that explicitly rejected the authority of the federal government in Mogadishu, giving Abu Dhabi port access without the diplomatic cost of recognizing Somaliland's independence while simultaneously accumulating the practical benefits of its fragmentation from Somalia. This pattern, what one analyst has called a strategy of calculated fragmentation rather than true partnership, is the UAE's playbook for East African influence. And it is precisely this playbook that Saudi Arabia has now committed to defeating. Riyadh's countermodel is the explicit defense of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Saudi Arabia defends the recognized Yemeni government. It defends Mogadishu's sovereignty over Somaliland. It backs the Sudanese armed forces as the legitimate authority in Khartoum. In every case where the UAE has backed a sub-state actor or secessionist movement, Saudi Arabia has taken the opposite position, championing the central government, the recognized sovereign authority, the internationally acknowledged state. This is not idealism, it is strategy. Because recognized central governments are far easier for Riyadh to cultivate, influence, and align with Saudi interests than fragmented sub-state entities that the UAE has already captured. Saudi Arabia wins by strengthening the institutions the UAE is trying to undermine. Israel's role in this picture adds a layer of complexity that is specific to the current moment in Middle Eastern politics, and that goes directly to the heart of what separates Saudi and Emirati strategic visions. The UAE normalized relations with Israel in September 2020 through the Abraham Accords, becoming the first Gulf state alongside Bahrain to do so since Jordan in 1994. That normalization has produced genuine and deep strategic cooperation between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv in technology, intelligence sharing, defense, and now, as the Somaliland episode demonstrates, in Horn of Africa, geopolitics. The UAE's willingness to align with Israeli strategic interests in Somaliland, whether through active encouragement of Israel's recognition or through its refusal to condemn it, reflects the depth of that partnership and the degree to which Abu Dhabi now considers Israeli interests aligned with its own in the competition for Red Sea and East African influence. Saudi Arabia has a fundamentally different relationship with Israel. Mbs'S has repeatedly stated that Saudi Arabia will normalize with Israel only on the condition of meaningful, tangible progress toward a Palestinian state. He has publicly called Israeli actions in Gaza genocide. He has refused to join the Abraham Accords despite enormous American pressure to do so, including during the Trump administration's intensive diplomatic engagement of 2025. Saudi Arabia's position on Israel is both a genuine moral and political stance and a strategic asset. It allows Riyadh to position itself as the defender of the Palestinian cause within the Arab and Islamic world, a positioning that is essential to the religious legitimacy that Saudi Arabia derives from its custodianship of Mecca and Medina. When Israel recognized Somaliland and when the UAE refused to condemn that recognition, Saudi Arabia was able to present itself to the entire Arab and African world as the only major Gulf power that takes Palestinian solidarity and Islamic solidarity seriously. That positioning cost Saudi Arabia nothing and gave it enormous moral authority with the 55 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, with the African Union's 55 member states, and with the broad coalition of countries that joined Riyadh's condemnation of Israel's move. The counter-alliance that Saudi Arabia assembled in response to the Israeli Somaliland recognition, drawing in Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, Qatar, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia itself, is not merely a response to a single diplomatic incident. It is the architecture of a new Red Sea security order, one centered on Saudi Arabia rather than on the UAE-Israel-Ethiopia triangle that had been quietly building its own alternative framework. The Horn Review has described Saudi Arabia as having masterfully synchronized Turkey's military projection, Egypt's diplomatic weight, and the fortified littoral positions of Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia into a singular defensive front. That is a remarkable coalition, spanning the entire eastern coastline of Africa from Egypt's Red Sea coast down through Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia, coordinated from Riyadh, and aligned against an alternative axis that Israel's Somaliland recognition had brought into the open. It is important, at this point, to be honest about what Saudi Arabia's Somalia policy actually is at its core, because framing it purely as noble defense of sovereignty and territorial integrity would be incomplete. The Gulf International Forum's Dr. John Calabresi, one of the most rigorous analysts of this situation, has described Riyadh's Somalia strategy as a calculated effort to reshape the Red Sea security order by ending Emirati influence, countering Iranian-aligned threats, and safeguarding the maritime and economic foundations of Vision 2030. It is calculated and self-serving, not altruistic. The Horn Review has noted directly that Saudi Arabia does not act as a benevolent stabilizer. It is a self-serving actor focused on maintaining influence in federal structures to strengthen its own position. Somalia's defense minister pleaded for Riyadh to intervene militarily against Somaliland's secessionist ambitions, not because Somalia and Saudi Arabia share deep bonds of brotherhood, but because both governments calculated that a Saudi-Somali alignment against the UAE-Israel-Somaliland axis served their respective interests. That is the reality of geopolitics in the Horn of Africa today, a theater in which every external actor, Saudi Arabia included, is pursuing its own interests through the language of sovereignty, stability, and legitimate governance. What makes this moment genuinely historic, however, is not just the immediate tactical outcomes. The UAE's retreat from Somalia, the military cooperation agreement between Riyadh and Mogadishu, the coalition that Saudi Arabia assembled in a matter of weeks. What makes it historic is what it reveals about the trajectory of power in the Red Sea and East Africa over the coming decade. Saudi Arabia has demonstrated in rapid succession across Yemen and Somalia that it has the capacity, the will, and the diplomatic sophistication to confront Emirati influence wherever it conflicts with Saudi strategic interests, and to win those confrontations decisively. It has demonstrated that its relationship with Washington, carefully cultivated through hundreds of billions of dollars in investment deals and defense agreements, can be leveraged to shape American foreign policy in specific regional theaters in ways that serve Saudi preferences. It has demonstrated that it can build multilateral coalitions, bringing together Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Pakistan, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia around shared positions that give Saudi Arabia the kind of institutional heft and collective legitimacy that no single bilateral relationship can provide. And it has done all of this through what GIS reports has called deliberate, pragmatic, sovereignty-oriented statecraft. The same approach that Mbs'S has been refining ever since Saudi Arabia's costly and ultimately unsuccessful military campaign in Yemen reminded him that the blunt instrument of military force has real limitations and that economic leverage, coalition building, and strategic patience can achieve outcomes that bombs cannot. The Saudi Arabia that is operating in the Horn of Africa in 2026 is different from the Saudi Arabia that launched Operation Decisive Storm in 2015 with the expectation of a quick, decisive victory over the Houthis. It is more sophisticated, more patient, more willing to play a long game, more willing to use its economic weight, its religious authority, its diplomatic relationships, and its personal connection to the American president as instruments of statecraft rather than relying primarily on military power. The implications for the broader Middle East map are significant. Every country in the Horn of Africa is now being drawn into the orbit of this Gulf rivalry, forced to choose between the Saudi-led coalition defending state sovereignty and territorial integrity on one side, and the UAE-Israel-Ethiopia axis on the other. For most of these countries, the choice is not difficult. The African Union and Arab League positions are clear. Saudi Arabia's coalition represents the international consensus. The UAE-Israel position is the outlier. That means the UAE and Israel are going to find it increasingly difficult to sustain their Horn of Africa ambitions against a Saudi-assembled coalition that has the numbers, the institutional backing, and the moral framing on its side. For Israel specifically, the Somaliland recognition may prove to have been a tactical win that created a strategic problem. Netanyahu secured a foothold in the Red Sea region and a potential future intelligence and security position near the Bab al-Mandab. But he also triggered a Saudi-led coalition response that has hardened positions across the Arab and African worlds in ways that make any broader Israeli normalization project in the Muslim world significantly more complicated. Every Arab leader who signed the OIC condemnation, every African Union member state that joined the censure, every Somali street protester who marched against Israeli recognition, they are all part of a political landscape that Saudi Arabia has shaped, and that makes the regional environment Israel was hoping to reshape through Somaliland more resistant, not more receptive, to Israeli influence. The geography of the Horn of Africa has always been contested. The Bab al-Mandab has been a strategic prize for powers ranging from the Ottoman Empire to British colonialism to Cold War superpowers. What is new is that the contest for this geography is now being run by Gulf powers, not by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two countries that share the same GCC membership, the same religion, the same language, and until recently, what appeared to be the same strategic vision. The fact that these two countries are now fighting proxy and diplomatic battles from Yemen's shattered coastline to the Horn of Africa reveals something profound about where the Arab world actually is right now. Not united by any common project, not aligned by any shared vision, but divided by competing ambitions for dominance in the post-oil era, ambitions that are being played out across some of the world's most fragile states at enormous cost to the people who actually live there.